Ezra-Nehemiah, a vision of ethnic purity supported by threats of imperial violence. The only official account of the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the return from exile is the combined book of Ezra-Nehemiah. The very first verses clearly express the religion of empire. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem in Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem." Ezra 1, 1-3. Not a prophet speaking the word of Yahweh, but a foreign king. Persia had defeated Babylon in the mid-6th century, and taking control of the region they now called Yehud, or the province beyond the river. Cyrus's claim to be doing the will of Yahweh is presented as if nothing at all about it was controversial. In fact, the prophet Isaiah confirms, "Thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him, and the gates shall not be closed. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and riches hidden in secret places, so that you may know that it is I, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob, and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I surname you, though you do not know me." Isaiah 45, 1-4. Note how the prophetic voice expresses Yahweh's intent that Cyrus knows that it is I who call you by your name, and I call you by your name, though you do not know me. Certainly the Cyrus of the book of Ezra claimed to know Yahweh and be doing Yahweh's will. Such a stance would shock the priests of Ahura Mazda, the prime deity of the Zoroastrian imperial religion that legitimized Cyrus's reign. The very notion that an imperial king has been empowered by what appears to be a defeated god of a colonized nation is absurd. It is just the start of the bald attempt in these books to claim Yahweh's authority for the Persian royal house and those appointed by them to rule the province of Yehud. Their key mediators in Jerusalem were the priest-scribe Ezra and the imperial governor Nehemiah. Why would the Persian king want to be known for building a house for Yahweh in Jerusalem? Probably because Jerusalem was a perfect military post between Persia and Egypt. In a world where soldiers traveled by foot, having a place of respite close to Egypt would be a great strategic advantage for Cyrus and his successors. Persia remained a powerful Eastern empire through the advent of Rome, as we'll see in a veiled reference to their mounted archers in the book of Revelation. The social vision of the book of Ezra follows directly from Josiah's reform and the use of Deuteronomy as a foundational text. It insists absolutely on a radical ethnic purity, as we hear in this lament from Ezra himself. "The officials approached me and said, 'The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this faithlessness the officials and leaders have led the way.' When I heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel, because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice." Ezra 9, 1-4. Ezra's theological judgment, expressed via his tearing his garments and sitting appalled, goes unchallenged. The emotional element leads readers to side with his anguished response. It is a deeply manipulative exercise in setting up a cruel requirement for those who want to be part of the restored community, as we hear in Ezra 10, 1-5. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. The people also wept bitterly. Shechaniah, son of Yahiel, of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, "We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it." Then Ezra stood up and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all Israel swear that they would do as had been said. So they swore. From this account, one might conclude that all the returned exiles support Ezra's decision to break up families and send the foreign women and children away. But to where exactly? How like recent scenes at the U.S.-Mexican border where parents are separated from their children. Yet the text silences the cries of those deemed by Ezra to be disposable in order to establish, quote-unquote, holy seed. The rebuilding of the city and temple did not take place without challenges. The combined book admits two such concerns. First, the former Israelites, now known as Samaritans, but referred to by the partisans of Persia as, quote, the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, unquote, seek to participate in the rebuilding, but are firmly rebuffed by the heads of the families in Israel. This leads to a long squabble in which Persian officials are bribed to delay for a generation the rebuilding. Needless to say, this did not establish fraternal relations between the two formerly united peoples. The second challenge arises in the book of Nehemiah. As Ezra narrates the book bearing his name, so does Nehemiah, giving both volumes a direct personal tone. Nehemiah had been the royal cupbearer, a post of intimate trust. Some of the local non-Judahite peoples interpret the rebuilding project as an act of rebellion against Persia, which leads to providing armed guards along the wall. Then an outcry arises that reveals the cost of following imperial script. Nehemiah 5 has often been an expression of hope for African American Christians. They have seen Nehemiah as a, quote, good governor, unquote, who listens to the cries of the oppressed and provides relief. Far be it from me to interrupt an interpretation that has given sustenance and inspiration to former slaves and their descendants. But a close reading of the situation suggests that Nehemiah's actions are not necessarily any more benevolent than FDR's embrace of the New Deal in the face of the rise of socialism in the United States. Let's listen to the charges raised by, quote, the people against their Jewish kin, unquote, in Nehemiah 5, 2-5. For there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, we must get grain so that we may eat and stay alive. There were also those who said, we are having to pledge our fields, our vineyards, and our houses in order to get grain during the famine. And there are those who said, we are having to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay the king's tax. Now our flesh is the same as that of our kindred, our children are the same as their children, and yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been ravished. We are powerless, and our fields and vineyards now belong to others. Note the echo into the story of the Egyptian people coming to Joseph, Pharaoh's right-hand man, according to Genesis 47. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. And Joseph answered, give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed, so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. In both situations, the leader oversees an economy in which people must give up money, land, houses, and freedom to obtain food during a famine. Whereas the Genesis story ends with Joseph enslaving what appears to be the entire Egyptian working population, in Nehemiah we hear this response. After thinking it over, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are all taking interest from your own people. And I called a great assembly to deal with them, and said to them, As far as we are able, we have bought back our Jewish kindred who had been sold to other nations. But now you are selling your own kin, who must then be bought back by us. They were silent, and could not find a word to say. So I said, The thing that you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us stop this taking of interest. Restore to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the interest on money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. Then they said, We will restore everything and demand nothing more from them. We will do as you say. And I called the priests and made them take an oath to do as they had promised. I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, So may God shake out everyone from house and from property who does not perform this promise. Thus may they be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen, and praised Yahweh. And the people did as they had promised. Nehemiah 5:7-13. When Nehemiah confronts the officials, they are silent. I imagine it as something like Captain Renault in Casablanca coming into Rick's place and shouting, I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on here, before the croupier hands over his own winnings. Nehemiah is hardly telling them something they don't know. What he is telling them is that the outcry in the street is strong enough that there must be a response so the Persian orders can be carried out and the wall completed. This is precisely the kind of imperial wisdom that Solomon had, but his hothead son Rehoboam lacked. How to keep the pressure on the working class, but not press so hard that they break. Nehemiah is not objecting to his peers profiting off the project. He is trying to prevent the project from collapsing in a working class rebellion. Franklin Roosevelt faced a similar situation in the 1930s. Socialism was strong and growing. The Russian Revolution was still a hopeful expression to many, with a wave of expected worldwide revolution in the air. FDR was also a wise imperial leader. He knew that the rich had to pay more taxes and the poor be given something on which to survive. Before the Social Security Act, many elderly Americans died in poorhouses, if the elite corporatists were to maintain their power. The rich were still the rich and the working class, but revolution was avoided. This was Nehemiah's strategy as well. The elite did not object to his proposal. The wall was built and the Persians were happy. They would rule over Yehud for 200 years. Ezra-Nehemiah uses what will become a biblical document in a new way, as itself proof of an individual's membership in the community. In Ezra 10:18 and following, we are given a list of the men who sent away their foreign wives. In Nehemiah 3, we have a list of those who made repairs on the city. In Nehemiah 7, we have another list, all the families of the returnees. Nehemiah 10 offers a list of signatures of, quote, our officials, our Levites, and our priests, unquote, on a sealed document. There is no biblical precedent for such an official statement of inclusion-exclusion of the people of Yahweh. The document is basically a confession of the wrongdoing of marrying foreign women and the acceptance of God's punishment of enslavement to the Persians. The document is itself a version of the history of Israel embedded within what became a book of the Bible. Its presence highlights the centrality of the narrative to the legitimacy of rule, whether imperial or otherwise. Ezra-Nehemiah won the day in the sense of becoming the official justification for submitting to Persian rule over Yehud, but it was not, as we've seen, the only voice coming out of exile.